We are less than a week away from the start of the 2025 season for the VCT Pacific League. So today we're going to be looking at the bracket for the kickoff tournament in Pacific and predict which two teams are going to make it to VCT Masters Bangkok. We're going to be going through each matchup and talking about which teams I think are going to start the year hot and which teams are going to fall short. So without further ado, let's get right into the bracket. So this is the entire kickoff tournament. We will be starting from top to bottom, which means we are starting with Boom Esports versus T1. A matchup that on paper looks pretty scary for Boom. Boom being one of the two new Ascension teams in the VCT Pacific League, getting to the grand final against Sin Prison Gaming, who are now known as Nongshim Red Force, who are also in the bracket, losing in a very tight, very close overtime Ascension grand final. So they could have easily been the ones that got in without having Bleed to be, a terrible organization and getting kicked out by Riot, but they got a lucky break with that. So they do end up here. They have a pretty decent team overall. I don't know if they were necessarily the favorites for that Ascension tournament going in, but they did do pretty well there. Unfortunately, they're going up against T1, a team that looks like they should be the newest super team in the Pacific League, getting some star-studded talent in the offseason, picking up Meteor from Gen G, Buzz from DRX. Mid-season last year, they got Stacks from DRX as well, so they've been poaching players that are very talented off of these other teams that are looking for a change. Or in Gen G's case, not being able to re-sign Meteor, and Meteor getting the big paycheck from T1 and looking like he hadn't skipped a beat. T1's offseason went very well. They won the Red Bull Homeground event. I think they only lost one match in the entire offseason. That was a one-map game. So I'm not putting too much stock in their loss, and am just thinking that their wins are pretty impressive. So while I do think Boom has potential to make this at least a close match, I don't think they have much chance of winning it. I do think T1 is going to be able to get off to that really good start after having the solid offseason that they had, and again, they just have too many heavy hitters to fail this early. But hey, anything is possible. Maybe Boom gets lucky here. Moving on, we have Global Esports versus Team Secret, a tale of two very different teams when it comes to offseason changes. Team Secret not doing much. They made changes during the season and they didn't make any in the offseason, so they're running back the same roster that was highlighted by Envy last season. They were an okay team last year. They were in about the middle of the pack when it comes to Pacific, but they did not qualify for any international tournaments. But they were good enough to at least stay in the hunt, qualify for playoffs, but they weren't able to go far in any of those playoffs. So they decided to run it back. Is that going to end up being a good decision? We will see. They have some decent pieces on the team, but I don't know if they're going to be able to get far in this bracket, but can they at least beat Global? Well, Global is pretty interesting because they went for an entire rebuild in the offseason after having the past 2 years for the team be incredibly poor, one of the worst teams in the entire league. A change was definitely needed, so they made changes to their coaching staff, they made changes to their entire roster, headlined by Crystal, a player that played for two different Tier 2 teams over the past 2 years that both made it to Ascension Grand Finals, one of those teams losing and one of those teams winning, that one being this year. I believe that was in the China region. But when it comes to the rest of the roster, there's just a bunch of unknowns when it comes to them. A lot of Tier 2 talent coming over, which could be very beneficial to them because a lot of Tier 2 players are making their way up. However, will that lack of Tier 1 experience hinder them? Are these players not, the best picks that they could have done in Tier 2? Overall, looks like they've done okay, but their offseason in the only one event that they played at that they put on, they did all right, but maybe not as good as what you would want to see from them. So I do think Team Secret is going to be able to take this one. Maybe it ends up being close. It's really up to Global on that one, but this one's just too hard to call, so I'll make what I think is the safe pick and put Team Secret. Moving on, we have Detonation Focus Me versus RRQ. DFM similar to Global, going through a very big rebuild, but they kept one player from last year's roster, and that is May. They also did keep a player by the name of C's, but he is listed as their sub, but who knows if he gets into some matches during the year. But they brought in other players like Art, Akame, Jinbon, a lot of players from Tier 2 in the Pacific region. Gwen is also in there as well, and their offseason went probably better than a lot of people thought it would. They actually did pretty decent at a lot of the events that they went to. Not overly dominant or anything, but they made it to the grand final of the Radiant Asia Invitational, losing to Paper X, but they beat them earlier in the bracket, so maybe that's a good sign. They didn't do great at the Riot Games 1 event, but they did okay at the Red Bull Homeground APAC qualifier, but they didn't make it to the main event. So it ends up being a pretty up and down offseason for them, but definitely a lot better than what we've seen from them in the regular VCT. Whereas RRQ, they're a team that maybe some people had faith in them last year, but they didn't really reach that potential. They did bring in Moniette partway through the season, and he performed well for them, but the team just didn't seem to have a lot of chemistry. Players not really being able to play to their strengths and make those plays off one another that maybe a team like Paper X could make. But there is definitely some talent there if they get their stuff together, if their coaching staff helps them get that synergy, then this roster could have some dangerous things about them. So in terms of this match against DFM, it's pretty interesting. I think it'll be pretty close overall, but I think Den Nation has shown enough for me to think that they would be able to win this match. Moving on, we have Zeta Division versus Non-Shim Red Force. Also, I zoomed in because I got tired of seeing the ads under me and stuff, so that's why this now looks a lot closer. But Zeta Division versus Non-Shim Red Force, we have one Ascension team versus a team that's been around for quite a long time, but Zeta Division has not been able to find consistency for the past couple years. Having a team that seemingly has promise and has potential to maybe make some noise in this league, but just really has not realized it. Especially in 2024, this team was pretty mid overall, so in the offseason they decided to bring in 3 new players from the Tier 2 team Fennel, and similar to DFM, having some pretty decent results in the offseason overall, doing okay at both the APAC Red Bull Home Grand Qualifier event, not being able to qualify for the main event because T1 took that spot, and then doing decent at the Riot Games 1 Invitational, winning 2 out of the 3 matches. So that's definitely some promising things there, but Non-Shim Red Force seems like a pretty dangerous team. Non-Shim Red Force, previously known as Sin Prisa Gaming, was the team that won the Pacific Ascension tournament, making their way all the way from Premier into the VCT. Very impressive feat for this group of young players. They have some really promising players on that roster, notably Persia, a player that a lot of people are very excited to see in the VCT. They have a player by the name of Dombi as their duelist player, and this roster was playing a lot of different agents during that Ascension Grand Final, which shows that they can be good in high pressure situations, but also be very flexible. So a lot of promise when it comes to them. Beating Zeta Division would be quite the way to start your VCT run. So do I think that they could do it? Honestly, while I haven't played, I think that's going to work to their advantage actually. I will say Non-Shim will beat them. I don't know if that's going to count as an upset in some people's eyes, but I definitely think it's possible. So moving back up to the top of this bracket, we have T1 versus Paper X. Man, getting this matchup this early in the bracket is quite the way to start. Already talked about T1, so I'll talk about Paper X, a team that should need no introduction. If you know the VCT, you know Paper X, but for those who don't know this team, I'll explain it to you. They have had the same roster for the past 2 seasons, and they got very close to winning their first international tournament all the way back in 2023. They went all the way to the grand finals of Champions, the very last tournament of the year. They got very close to taking that trophy, which would have been the first for this region that has now been claimed by Gen G of last year, but Paper X were not able to get that trophy. So they fall short. Their player Jane has to remove himself from the roster because he needs to do military service in Singapore. They bring in Moniette to be the replacement. They have a decent performance at Madrid, but then Moniette gets kicked off the roster because now Jane can come back. And while Paper X continued to have strong performances in their own region, their international play really dropped off last year. They lost early in the playoff bracket at VCT Masters Shanghai, and then at Champions they lost to the eventual winners of the tournament in Edward Gaming, but that's a team that they usually beat, and that was in the group stage. So a very early exit for this team capped off what was overall a pretty disappointing year for a team that should have very high standards. But now it's a new year, a new meta, and maybe with Neon now being nerfed, this is a meta that Paper X could find themselves really thriving in. One of the criticisms that we've heard about certain players of this roster, such as Jin, and one of the complaints that people have levied at this roster, more specifically their duelist players in both Jin and Something, is the fact that they are not flexible. Their character lists in comparison to players like Devi and Forsaken were a lot smaller. They mainly kept to, say, Jet for Something and then Raze for Jin. They would play other characters here and there, like Something would try some Gecko to varying degrees of success. But now what we've seen in the offseason is Jin and Something listening to that criticism, at least seemingly, and playing a lot of different characters to, so far, pretty good success. We've seen Jane on characters like Killjoy, we've seen Something on characters like Sova, so maybe with that hole being plugged up, this team can actually go on quite the run, and with how the map pool is, and with how the characters are right now, this meta might be very beneficial to them. Unfortunately, they're going against T1, a team that I personally think is going to be the best team in this league overall. Meteor, Buzz, I didn't even talk about Aizu or Sylvan when I talked about this team, all incredible players. They definitely could also thrive in this current meta, and I think they're just going to be absolutely dangerous. So can Paper X overcome that? I think for now I'll say that T1 moves on. PaperX should be qualifying for every single international this year. They have had a very long streak of making it to internationals. So we'll see how the rest of the bracket goes. I'm not like planning this out ahead of time. I'm just going with how the bracket is and just talking about things. But for now, I think T1 makes it to the upper semifinals. Moving down the list, we have Talon versus Team Secret. Talon's a pretty interesting team. They also didn't make any roster changes in the offseason because they made one pretty big addition in bringing in a player called Primi right before playoffs of Stage 2. Primi was known as a ranked demon in the region, and then he comes in and he performed very well for them, being able to help get this team to Champions, but they didn't even win a single map at Champions, a very early and disappointing exit for them. But hey, at least it's progress, and Primi's still very young. He was playing ranked, which is much different from how pro play works. Maybe with some more pro play under his belt, he can have a successful year. They also have some decent players like Governor, they have Ban, they have Cruz. This is a roster that has stuck mostly together for a reason. Their offseason hasn't really gone great, however, they didn't win a match at the Soup League tournament, not doing well in the Red Bull Homegrown APAC qualifier. They did okay at the 10 Invitational tournament, but didn't get that far. So we really don't know how the year is going to go for this team. It could go either way. Either they learn from their mistakes and learn from their past and have a really solid year, or they lose to teams like Team Secret, who definitely have the ability to overtake Talon in a match like this. I think this could be quite close. Don't know if this would really be an upset or not, but I think I'll put Team Secret down for this one. I don't think Talon would be the hardest team to beat for Team Secret, so I will give them and their fans the credit for now and say that they will go on to face T1, which not going to say my opinion on that yet. We'll get to that, but yeah, I think you can predict. Moving down the list, we have Genji versus DFM. Genji was by and large the best team of the entire VCT in 2024, only losing 3 matches internationally overall. I haven't done the math, but they probably have the most wins internationally of any team in 2024. They did lose in the group stage at Champions, but they went against both Sentinels and Team Heretics, 2 teams that went very deep, and they did win Pacific's first trophy at VCT Masters Shanghai, and they went to the grand finals at Madrid. So if they kept that same exact roster, maybe they're still the best team. However, they have lost 2 players of last season, one of them being Lakia, who hasn't found a new roster, and that's not the biggest loss. Lakia is definitely a good player, but definitely had his really down moments of the year, not coming big in some of the matches that they probably should have had him come up big in. But the real big loss is Meteor, one of the best players in the world in 2024, was probably their MVP during their trophy run at Shanghai, and just overall being a clutch god and one of the best Sentinels in the entire world. So what they end up doing to replace these 2 players is they bring in a player by the name of Yeoman and Foxy9. Yeoman coming up from tier 2 looks like a decent player so far. He could be seen as an upgrade on Lakia. However, Foxy9 for Meteor, those are some tough shoes to fill. Foxy9 being a player that comes over from DRX. He was in and out of DRX's main roster for a while. He finally had a full-time spot in 2024 to varying levels of consistency. DRX being a good but inconsistent team last year, and Foxy9 being one of the players that got kicked out of the roster in favor of the new players they have coming up. Foxy9 definitely has a lot of talent, but he has shown to be pretty inconsistent. And while Genji still have an amazing core of Texture, Munchkin, and Karen, 3 incredible players, you need a full roster to be firing on all cylinders to be able to get super far. So losing out on Meteor, that's definitely a big thing. And in the offseason, those 2 new players, while I will give them the pass that it's just the offseason and they're learning the new team, they're learning systems, they've consistently been around the bottom of the leaderboards. Neither of those players needs to be the one that is carrying the team like Meteor did, but this team is definitely not as deep as they were last season. They're still very deep, and when it comes to versus DFM, yeah, they're going to beat them, but I still am concerned about Genji overall, but they will at least start off their kickoff good. Moving on, we have DRX versus Non-Chum Red Force. So I was just talking about DRX, about their changes. They ended up making quite a bit of changes in the offseason, but they also reverted one of those changes. So they let Buzz go to T1. He was one of the only remaining players of the previous Vision Strikers roster that this team turned into. So the only player remaining from that roster that was really good but just couldn't win a trophy is Mako. Mako was IGLing for them at the end of last year. Looks like Freen, one of their new additions, will be taking up that mantle. We'll see if that sticks. Their IGL position was pretty all over the place in 2024, so maybe that happens again. They also kicked Bane off the roster in favor of a player named Athen, but just like a week ago, they swapped Athen out for Bane again. So Bane is back in the roster. He had pretty poor results overall in 2024, but hey, maybe just, and that was just stage 2, so maybe it just been a short amount of time, new player, Maybe he just needed some time to really get, meshed into the roster, so maybe it works this time. They also bring in a player by the name of Hyman. He will be their duelist player. He's another kind of ranked demon type player. We'll see how well he does. DRX overall has had a pretty inconsistent offseason. They did okay at the 10 Invitational tournament, but lost to Talon later in the bracket. They started off Super League well, but then lost to Gen G. And then in the Radiant Asia tournament, they won their first 2 matches and then lost their last 2. So up and down, and they were testing a lot of things, and they're trying to figure out who their IGL was. It ended up being Freen. Also, their head coach in Germany was off for most of the offseason. He was apparently getting married. So you can take their offseason with a grain of salt, and they've shown that they haven't been shy to make changes when they feel like it's needed, like bringing Bane back in the timing that they did. So I'm not confident that that's going to be, meshing right away. And you're playing this new team in Nonshim, who you're not going to have a lot of research on aside from the Ascension tournament and whatever they do against Zeta. I think while DRX should probably be the favorites for this one, I think I need some upsets in this bracket. So I'm going to say that Nonshim is the one that takes that. I don't know, something about DRX this season just doesn't give me a lot of confidence. They definitely have some good shooters on the team, but I don't know. It's weird for DRX this year. All right, so now that we've explained all the teams, we can get through the rest of the bracket a lot faster. We're going to be going down to the lower round. DRX versus Boom, both teams coming off of the loss. I think DRX probably would have the upper hand there. Den Nation versus Global, really hard to tell because Global we just don't know, but I will give Den Nation the benefit of the doubt. Talon versus RRQ, 2 middle of the pack teams from last year. I'll say that Primi can have a really good game against them. And PaperX versus Zeta Division, not gonna waste time. I think PaperX definitely wins that one. Moving on to lower round 2, we have DFM versus DRX, the battle of the Ds. Another one that's kind of hard to tell, but you would think that DRX would be able to win this one, but I'll give DFM a little bit of benefit of the doubt. Again, I need some upsets in here, but I'm not going to have an upset for PaperX versus Talon. PaperX definitely wins that one. Moving back up to the upper semifinals, T1 versus Team Secret. Yeah, as I said earlier, I'm not wasting time on that one. Gen G versus Nonshim Red Force. Man, Nonshim might have a chance in this one, honestly, and this would be a bit of an impressive run for them to get to this point by beating both Zeta and DRX. However, while I think Gen G has been nerfed, I think they're still good enough to get pretty far. Moving back down to lowers, Team Secret versus DFM. You know what? I'll believe the hype a little bit. DFM moves on to lower round 4. Nonshim versus PaperX. Honestly, it'd be crazy if Nonshim won this one, but PaperX are going to be trying to make their lower bracket run here, which means that they will face off against DFM. I think PaperX definitely moves on in that one. So we have our top 3 when it comes to this team. Impressive for DFM to make top 4. I'm not sure if they're going to show up as number 4 on my power ranking. Wait for that. But hey, at least they have this run. But we're talking about the upper final now. T1 versus Gen G, the presumably new super team versus the old super team. This one would be very close in my eyes, but I'm going to give the edge to T1, which means that Gen G versus PaperX is going to be the lower final for this one. Man, it would be weird for either of these teams to not be at an international with how good Gen G was the year prior, with how good and consistently at tournaments PaperX has been. In my way to early predictions video, I had both T1 and Gen G making it. Do I still stick to that? I think for this one, I'm going to change it. I think PaperX is going to qualify for Bangkok. I think Gen G, with their new roster, it might just take a little bit of more time for the team to really gel, which means that these 2 teams are going to Bangkok. I don't know if it particularly matters who wins this one, but I think PaperX will get the rematch win. So while I have sworn off PaperX being able to win international tournaments, I predicted them for like 3 separate tournaments and they let me down every time. I will never predict them in a Masters or a Champions again unless they prove me wrong, but hey, they're usually very consistent in their own region. And as I said, I think the meta is going to be good for them right now. It's kind of weird to me that I didn't choose Gen G, but I think PaperX, at least on paper, should have the better roster. And PaperX, they usually win in their own region. Last year's kickoff, they didn't. Gen G being the ones that beat them. But maybe they can get the win over T1. Anyways, this is my full bracket. I think it's pretty decent overall. I think we have a good amount of upsets going on. I would say that DFM versus DRX, if DFM wins that one, that would be an upset. Same probably with this one. I think DFM making top 4. I didn't even really realize when I was picking them, but top 4 would be very impressive for a team that was basically in last place for the past 2 years. But hey, anything is possible, and I like good stories like that, so I hope it happens. Anyways, that is it for today's video. Let me know in the comment section down below what your bracket is. Where do you think I went right? Where do you think I went wrong? Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next one. Bye!